In 1873, in the frozen corridors of Midwestern orphanage, the children stopped sleeping. For 3 nights, they heard her scream. Then silence. Her name was Emma Richter. But by spring, the record swore she had never existed. This is where our descent begins. The Richter case is one of those half-erased American horrors, the kind that lives only in the footnotes of burned parish records and the torn margins of medical ledgers. But what makes this story endure, what makes it terrifying, is not just that a girl vanished, but that she was never supposed to be remembered at all. St. Gertrude's Orphanage stood in Cold Heart, Illinois, its wooden halls sagging under disease, starvation, and neglect. Hundreds of children passed through its doors in the brutal winter of 1873. Emma should have been just one more, but Emma Richter was not like the others. Witnesses spoke of her memory, how she repeated entire sermons word for word, even those preached years before her birth. They whispered that she predicted deaths before they came, describing fevers and accidents in chilling detail. Others claimed she bled differently or not at all. What happened to her was not the accident of one winter, but a deliberate act of erasure. For the priests, the doctors, the town elders, Emma became an inconvenience too dangerous to leave alive and too impossible to admit existed. Yet traces survive. A cracked photograph, a diary page half-burned, and physician's scrawled line that chills the blood to this day. She waits in silence. She remembers everything, and she will not stay buried. The year 1873 carved itself into Illinois memory as one of cold, hunger, and quiet death. Newspapers from the time described a famine of spirit as well as of body. Grain rotted in silos, while blizzards buried whole towns under white silence. Families, unable to feed their children, left them at the gates of institutions like St. Gertrude's Orphanage, a squat, wooden structure pressed against the edge of endless fields. The orphanage was meant to shelter 80 children. That winter, it held nearly 300. Infants slept two to a crib, the older ones curled together on straw mats, breath condensing in the frozen air. The sound of coughing became constant, punctuated by the scrape of metal spoons against empty bowls. It was in this atmosphere of deprivation that Emma Richter arrived. No birth certificate, no record of parents, no parish record. Simply a girl delivered one night by a man who gave no name, signed no paper, and walked away into the storm. Emma did not weep like the other children. She sat perfectly still in the intake room, hands folded, eyes following every movement with unnatural focus. The nuns whispered of her pallor, her silence. Her gaze seemed too steady for a child so small. Within days, Emma distinguished herself in ways no one could ignore. She repeated prayers after hearing them once. She recited entire lists of names of children she had never met, tracing their lives in terrifying detail. And when fever spread to the orphanage, she walked the halls at night, whispering the names of those who would not survive till morning. The hunger that winter was real. But hunger alone could not explain Emma Richter. The town had taken in a child who seemed to know not only the present, but the future. Emma Richter did not blend into the tide of abandoned children that washed through St. Gertrude's gates. From her first days, she seemed carved from a different silence, one that unsettled the air around her. The nuns recorded that she never cried, never begged for food, and never asked for her parents, while the other orphans clung to one another for warmth. Emma sat alone at the edge of the dormitory, awake long after the candles had been extinguished. Her eyes, large and dark, reflected the faint light of the moon as though they carried their own source of illumination. At first, the sisters considered her a blessing, a quiet child who caused no trouble. But then came the incident with Sister Margaret. One evening, as Margaret prepared to strike a boy who had stolen bread, Emma's voice cut through the dining hall, calm, precise, but cold. She told the sister that Margaret's own brother had died in a river crossing 22 years earlier, and that his last words were a curse against her. Margaret froze, pale as wax. She had never spoken of her brother to anyone. Word spread quickly. Children avoided Emma. Adults whisper behind closed doors. Some thought her gifted. Others thought her touched by something unholy. And yet, there was another detail, one recorded in the lost intake ledger, that resurfaced decades later. Emma never ate. Bowls were placed before her. Bread and broth rationed like every other child's. But none remembered seeing her lift food to her lips. Days passed, weeks even, yet her body never wasted. This unnatural endurance, combined with her impossible knowledge, drew the attention of men who wore both collars and lab coats. Priests saw the devil's work. Doctors saw a specimen. Both agreed on one thing. Emma Richter could not remain among the other children. It began with memory, not the ordinary kind, but something that mocked the limits of human recall. During morning lessons, when the nuns drilled the children on scripture, Emma would recite entire passages after hearing them once. Not just the words, but the cadence, the pauses, the inflection of the sister who spoke them. At first, this impressed the staff. But soon they realized Emma's memory stretched far beyond what she should have been capable of. One afternoon, Father Callahan tested her. He opened a Latin text, asterisk de civitate de asterisk, and read aloud a single line. Emma repeated it perfectly. Then she recited the following 10 lines, though no one in the room had spoken them. Her voice, low and steady, carried a rhythm that made the other children clutch their rosaries. But her memory did not stop at books. Emma recalled details of conversations she could not have overheard. Words whispered in the rectory, arguments behind closed doors, secrets muttered in the confessional. She repeated them without hesitation, without error. It was as if every sound that passed within the orphanage walls was hers to keep. Soon the children began to fear her. When a girl named Clara tore her dress, Emma described the accident in exact detail before Clara spoke a word. When another boy hid a stolen crust of bread, Emma told him where he placed it, down to the splinter crack in the floorboards. The orphans began calling her the glass ear, a child who heard everything, remembered everything, and never forgot. But memory was only the beginning. Within weeks, Emma's voice shifted from what had been to what was coming, and the first of her predictions would turn the orphanage into a place of dread. The first prediction seemed like coincidence. A boy named Thomas had fallen ill with fever, his breathing ragged in the night. While the sisters prayed by his bedside, Emma stood in the doorway and spoke softly. Asterisk, he will not wake again after the bell strikes 3. Asterisk, the nun scolded her, horrified at the cruelty of such words. Yet, when the chapel bell tolled in the early hours, Thomas exhaled once and did not draw breath again. Whispers spread. Children began to glance toward Emma when another coughed or stumbled, as though waiting for a quiet judgment. At first, she said nothing, but soon she began to offer predictions unasked. A broken arm before it happened, a lantern fire no one could have foreseen, even a visitor's miscarriage, revealed in merciless detail before the woman herself knew. Her voice was not frantic, not prophetic in tone. It was clinical, detached, as though she were reading from a book already written. The priest demanded explanations. The doctors, summoned again, dismissed it as childish imagination. Yet the predictions kept coming, and they always proved true. One evening, when the sisters were preparing the meager supper, Emma placed her untouched bowl of broth on the table and said flatly, Asterisk, tonight, 2 children will not wake. Asterisk, by dawn, 2 small bodies were carried out into the snow. Fear took hold of St. Gertrude's. To the orphans, Emma became less a child than an omen. They avoided her gaze, refusing to sit beside her, terrified that her eyes would mark them next. To the staff, she was an embarrassment, a problem too dangerous to ignore yet too extraordinary to discard. And so the church began to take notice. What lived inside Emma Richter was no longer seen as memory or sickness, but a sign. By the spring of 1873, Emma Richter had become a subject of whispers not only in the orphanage but in the parish that oversaw it. St. Gertrude's was under the eye of the Catholic Church, and the reports reaching the rectory disturbed even the most disciplined priests. At first, they visited under the guise of confession and prayer. Father Callahan described her as a child who does not falter, whose voice is steady as stone. When he placed a crucifix before her, Emma did not recoil. She did not pray either. She only stared at it, then asked in a voice too calm, Asterisk, why do you hold ire when your faith is hollow? Asterisk. Another priest, Father Albrecht, pressed her further. He brought her into the chapel after dark and demanded she kneel. Emma did not. Instead, she recited a homily he had given 8 years earlier in another parish, word for word, including the passages he had abandoned mid-sermon and replaced with silence. The clergy grew divided. Some whispered divine gift, perhaps the soul of a saint reborn into frail flesh. Others muttered a possession, a counterfeit spirit clothed in a child's body. Both camps agreed on one thing. Emma had to be studied, and so she was placed under closer watch. The priest instructed the nuns to record her behavior, her words, even her silences. They tested her with relics and rituals, observing her lack of fear, her lack of reverence. Emma neither mocked nor praised. She simply endured. The church's interest was never neutral. Behind their piety lay fear, and behind fear lay control. They understood one truth the townsfolk dared not speak. If Emma Richter was left unchecked, her existence alone threatened the church's authority. The decision was made. Emma would be examined more closely, by men of science, summoned quietly and sworn to secrecy. When the priest's questions yielded no answers, the church turned to men who claimed to deal in certainty, physicians. In the spring of 1873, 3 doctors from Chicago arrived at St. Gertrude's under cover of night. Their presence was never announced to the parish. Their names never entered into the orphanage ledgers. But fragments of their notes, smuggled into archives decades later, reveal what they encountered. The doctors approached Emma not as a child, but as a specimen. They measured her pulse, slow, unnaturally steady. They checked her skin for warmth and color, and noted the absence of typical circulation patterns. One wrote in his margins, Asterisk, the flesh is pliant, but blood is reluctant to surface. Asterisk, they observe her eyes under lamplight and described a reflective quality, like a nocturnal animal. They tested her reflexes, startling her with sudden noise or bright flame. She did not flinch. She did not blink. And then came the most chilling discovery. Emma did not appear to breathe as other children did. Her chest rose and fell only when observed directly, as though mimicking the act of respiration. At rest, for long stretches of time, she seemed to require no air at all. The doctors argued in hushed tones. Some insisted it was hysteria of the observers, tricks of perception. Others, more quietly, confessed that Emma defied physiology. But what unsettled them most was not her body, but her words. During examinations, Emma spoke not to doctors, but of them, describing ailments they carried in secret, naming relatives they had lost, reciting their sins with clinical detachment. One doctor fled, refusing to return. The other 2 requested permission to conduct more rigorous tests. The church granted it, and thus Emma was moved into the orphanage's basement, a place of stone and shadow where experiments began in earnest. The basement of St. Gertrude's was no place for children. It was a root cellar converted into a crude infirmary. Stone walls sweating with damp, air thick with mildew, a single iron lamp casting shadows that trembled with every draft. It was here, beneath the chapel floorboards, that Emma Richter was confined for study. The doctors insisted on restraints. Leather straps were fastened to a wooden chair, her wrists bound so tightly that the skin bruised beneath them. Emma did not resist. She sat silently, watching the men move their instruments across the table. Scalpels, needles, glass jars of chemicals, a polished stethoscope. The first trials were simple. A pinprick to the arm, a shallow incision on the palm. The nuns present reported what the doctors scribbled reluctantly. Emma did not bleed. The skin opened, but only the faintest trace of fluid, clear, thin, almost like water, rose before sealing again. Next came exposure tests. She was held near open flame, her skin reddening but not blistering. She was deprived of food and water for weeks. Her body did not waste, her eyes never dulled. When chloroform was pressed to her face, she inhaled deeply, but her consciousness never wavered. The doctors grew unsettled. One attempted to measure her heartbeat with careful pressure. Emma turned her head then, for the first time during testing, and spoke. Asterisk, your daughter's lungs will drown before she sees 10 years. Asterisk, the man recoiled, his hand shaking. He had never told anyone of the child born sickly in Chicago. The experiments continued for days, then weeks. Each test failed to explain Emma. Each discovery only deepened the mystery. And through it all, Emma never screamed, never wept, never asked why. She only watched, silent as stone, until she began to speak in voices that were not her own. The first time Emma's voice split, the doctors thought it was a trick of the acoustics in the cellar. Stone walls often bent sound, made it echo strangely. But then it happened again and again, and no one could deny what they were hearing. While restrained in her chair, Emma began reciting a prayer. At first it was her own soft voice, measured and deliberate. Then, without pause, a second tone joined it. Deeper, male, overlapping with her words, yet perfectly synchronized. By the time she reached the Gloria Patri, 3 voices poured from her small mouth, rising and falling in unnatural harmony. Witnesses described it as unbearable, not loud, not violent, but profoundly wrong. One nun vomited into her apron. Another fainted, her rosary clattering to the floor. The doctors, rattled though they were, forced themselves to listen. They noticed that each voice seemed to carry distinct accents. One German, one Irish, one unplaceable but ancient in cadence. Over the following days, Emma's multiplicity grew. Sometimes she spoke in layered tones, sometimes in alternating bursts, switching between the mid-sentence without effort. A child's lilt became a man's baritone, then a whisper so low it seemed to rumble from the stone floor. The words themselves were worse than the sound. Emma spoke of forgotten wars, naming dates and places with precision. She quoted obscure scriptures that none of the clergy present had ever studied. She described sins committed in private, acts buried in shame, dragging them into the open with merciless clarity. The priests called it possession. The doctors called it pathology. But in their private notes, fear bled to their language. Asterisk, we are not studying her. We are being studied. She looks at us as one might regard insects, and the voices, whoever they are, speak through her only when they choose. Asterisk, and always, in every tone, there was the same chilling certainty. Emma Richter knew things she could not know. The orphans upstairs had no words for what was happening beneath their feet, but children know fear without explanation. At night, when the cellar door groaned open and the doctors descended with their lamps, the younger ones pulled blankets over their heads. They whispered that Emma was not a girl anymore, that she was a doorway. Strange things began to happen among them. Small accidents multiplied. A child toppled from a stairwell and broke his neck. Another vanished from the dormitory. Her bed empty at dawn, with no signs of flight or struggle. Some swore they heard soft singing to the floorboards, a melody in 3 voices, echoing up from the dark. Those who had once played with Emma avoided even speaking her name. The older children invented a ritual. They spat on the ground before passing the cellar door, as though trying to ward off her gaze. One boy, no older than 8, claimed he had seen her eyes through the slats in the cellar stairs. Not the eyes of a child, he said, but a dozen eyes layered within each other, blinking in silence. He told this story to the nuns, trembling. By morning, the boy was gone. The sisters whispered that his mother, who had left him years earlier, had come to reclaim him. But no carriage was seen, no paper signed. His bed remained stripped, as if he had never been there. Fear hollowed the orphanage. The children grew thin, not only from hunger but from sleeplessness, jumping at every creak of wood, every toll of the chapel bell. And through it all, Emma remained below, silent except when the voices chose to surface. It was as if the building itself bent around her, feeding her presence with every disappearance. By midsummer, the priests no longer spoke of miracle or demon. They spoke only of containment. On a sweltering August Sunday, Father Albrecht gathered the orphans, the sisters, and a handful of townsfolk into the chapel. The pews creaked beneath their frail bodies, the air thick with heat and unease. The father's voice carried a quiver that no one had heard before, not in baptisms, not in funerals. He called a sermon of fire. He spoke not of comfort, but of danger. There is, he said, a seed in our midst, not born of God nor of man, a child who wears the shape of innocence, but carries a flame that cannot be quenched. His eyes did not name Emma, but every soul in the room knew of whom he spoke. He warned that some flames do not warm but consume, that if left unchecked, this one will hollow the orphanage, the parish, and perhaps the town itself. We are tested, he cried, not in whether we can endure, but whether we can sever what should never have rooted among us. The children wept. The nuns lowered their heads. Yet even as he thundered, Father Albrecht's own hands trembled. His notes, discovered years later in a locked drawer, reveal the truth. He feared Emma not because she was possessed, but because she was something older than possession. In his words, asterisk, she is not the vessel of the devil, but the memory of fire itself, a voice from before Christ, before the law, before the world was bound in Scripture. Asterisk, that night, after the sermon, the townsfolk whispered of purging flames. Some demanded she be drowned in the river. Others urged an exorcism, a burning, a burial in holy ground. But the church would not allow mob justice. Emma was too valuable to discard, and too dangerous to release. So the decision was made in secret. She would be silenced not with fire, but with silence itself. In the weeks after the fire sermon, Rothschild carried on with an eerie stillness. Shops opened, bread was baked, sermons were sung, but beneath the motions lived a silent tremor. The townsfolk spoke in half-sentences, their voices dropping to whispers whenever Emma's name threatened to surface. At the baker's stall, customers crossed themselves twice instead of once. Mothers clutched their children closer as they walked past the orphanage gates, their eyes avoiding the windows where Emma sometimes appeared, her pale face framed by the warped glass. Men who once laughed freely at the tavern now drank with stiff backs, muttering of unnatural fires and unfinished baptisms. Rumors swelled like rot under floorboards. Some swore they heard hymns in the wrong tongue, words older than Latin, slipping through the orphanage walls at night. Others claimed that when Emma passed the cemetery, the ground seemed to breathe, as though the earth itself shifted to meet her shadow. The mayor urged calm. The parish urged prayer. But fear has a way of fermenting into violence. More than once, crude symbols of protection, salt circles, ash crosses, knives buried in doorframes, appeared outside homes. And twice, torches were carried near the orphanage gates by men whose courage dissolved only when the wind rose suddenly, snuffing their flames. The panic did not erupt in riots or fires. It sank deeper, quieter. Rothschild became a town where smiles stiffened into masks, where bells tolled heavier, and where silence grew loud enough to choke. In his journal, Father Albrecht recorded, asterisk, the town does not scream. It strangles itself with silence. And silence, in its patience, is more dangerous than fire. Asterisk, by the spring of 1874, Emma had grown from a frail, coughing child into something else. Something watchful, deliberate. Those who tended her noticed her silence had taken on new weight. She no longer whimpered in fever or cried when struck by night terrors. Instead, she studied. Her gaze followed movements with unnerving precision, as though she were reading not people but the hidden currents of their souls. One nurse swore Emma could anticipate her every action. The tray brought before it was asked, the candle lit before the dusk fell, the exacting whisper before lips even parted. Another claimed the girl knew thoughts not yet spoken, turning her head to answer questions still forming in the air. Her body once thin and brittle, no longer bore the same weakness. Her fever ceased. Her limbs strengthened with unnatural quickness. She was often found standing barefoot in the orphanage courtyard before dawn, her nightdress trailing in the dew, her eyes fixed toward the steeple as though listening to a sound that no one else could hear. But it was the animals that sealed the town's unease. Birds no longer landed near her. Dogs whined and pressed themselves flat against the ground when she passed. Cats hissed and tore free from their owner's arms. Yet Emma did not flinch. She watched them recoil with a calm that unsettled even the sternest priests. When confronted, she spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were cold and clear, stripped of a child's cadence. One phrase was written in a nurse's trembling hand, preserved in the parish ledger. Asterisk. The fire was not outside me. It was waiting. Asterisk. For the first time, Rothschild began to wonder if Emma Richter was not a victim of misfortune, but the vessel of something ancient that had chosen her. The turning point came not through Emma herself, but through paper, faded, crumbling journals that had been buried in the parish archives and sealed for decades. Father Albrecht, restless and consumed by dread, descended into the vaults beneath the church, where dust lay like ash in iron-clasped, rusted over forgotten bindings. What he unearthed chilled him deeper than Emma's silent stare. The journals dated back to 1812, when Rothschild was little more than a scattering of cabins and a half-built chapel. They were written in a trembling hand by the town's first pastor, Elias Winterbourne. In them, he described a girl, another orphan unnamed, who had arrived with a wagon of settlers from Pennsylvania. Pale, fevered, and strange. Her presence, Winterbourne wrote, was followed by crop blight, infant deaths, and a great fire that consumed the town's first church. The details were grotesquely familiar. Unexplained fevers, unnatural strength, animals fleeing in terror. Winterbourne wrote that the girl's body never aged, even after 3 years. Then, without warning, she vanished. Not died, vanished. The final entry was worse than the rest. The pastor confessed that he and the elders had sealed her name, her existence, and her records, fearing that to speak of her was to invite her return. "We buried her truth beneath God's house," Winterbourne scrawled. Asterisk, but the house trembles still. Asterisk, Albrecht stared at the words until the candle guttered low. His hand shook as he traced the faded ink, realizing what the parish had hidden from generations. Emma Richter was not the first. She was not unique. She was part of a recurrence, something cyclic, something waiting. When he returned the journals to their box, he whispered a prayer, but in the silence of the crypt, it was answered by the sound of faint breathing that was not his own. By midsummer, the orphanage no longer seemed a place of refuge. Its halls, once filled with the cries and laughter of children, had grown oppressive, heavy with an atmosphere that thickened after dusk. The boards creaked as though bearing invisible weight. Windows fogged from the inside, despite warm weather, and in the silence, faint tapping echoed along the walls, like fingernails grazing wood from within. The children felt it first. They whispered of shadows that lingered after lanterns were snuffed out, shapes that moved with the rhythm of breath, bending low beside their beds. Some claimed Emma wandered at night, her steps soundless, her pale gown trailing down the hall like a ripple of white smoke. But when asked in the morning, she would deny ever leaving her room. Nurses grew restless. They reported hearing murmurs in languages they did not know, low, layered voices spilling from the rafters above the dormitory. Twice, they found doors locked from the inside, though no child had the key. And more than once, crucifixes were discovered turned upside down, their nails warped as though bent by heat. The building itself seemed to resist its keepers. Doors swelled and stuck, refusing to open until Emma passed by. The well in the courtyard turned black, its water reeking of sulfur. And the chapel within the orphanage, once the children's sanctuary, now left them trembling. When Emma entered, candles flickered violently, some extinguishing in unison as though choked by unseen hands. One sister fled the orphanage entirely, leaving behind only a single note. Asterisk, the house is no longer ours. It has taken her side. Asterisk, from that point forward, few dared to sleep soundly inside Rothschild walls. The orphanage had become not merely haunted, but possessed by its most silent resident. By autumn, the town's devotion fractured. The church, once the unshakable anchor of Rothschild, faltered under a weight it could neither name nor dispel. Attendance dwindled. Hymns rang hollow, sung by fewer voices each week. Some parishioners stayed home, clinging to improvised rituals with salt and smoke. Others turned to silence, as though refusing to speak God's name might protect them from drawing Emma's attention. Father Albrecht fought desperately to preserve order. He held extra services, commanded prayer vigils, and recited exorcisms beneath his breath until his voice cracked. But each time Emma was seen in the pews, a tremor ran through the congregation. She sat motionless, pale and still, her eyes fixed not on the altar but on the rafters above, as though searching for something older than the cross itself. The clergy grew divided. Some declared Emma a test of faith, proof that Rothschild must kneel harder, pray longer, starve sin from its soil. Others whispered of abandoning her altogether, casting her out beyond the woods to whatever fate awaited her. But no one dared confront her openly. Even those who hated her most admitted the air bent strangely in her presence, that time itself seemed to slow when she walked past. The breaking point came one stormy evening when lightning struck the steeple. The bell tower collapsed in splintered ruin, crushing graves and twisting the iron cross into a grotesque angle. Many swore they saw Emma watching from the orphanage steps, her face lit pale by the storm's glow. She did not smile. She did not weep. She only watched, as though the destruction were inevitable. For the first time, the parishioners began to wonder if their prayers were not only unanswered, but unheard. Faith had not been tested. It had been dismantled. The first disappearance was written off as misfortune. A farmhand failed to return from the fields. His lantern was found extinguished by the riverbank, the soil disturbed as if something had dragged him into the reeds. The second was harder to explain. Two sisters from the orphanage, last seen kneeling in the chapel, vanished between one prayer and the next. Their rosaries were discovered on the pew, their beads cracked like bone under pressure. By the time the third came, a constable whose boots remained in the road though his body did not. The town could no longer deny it. Rothschild was being hollowed from within. Whispers turned to accusations. Some claimed Emma was seen near each site, her pale figure gliding in and out of the fog like a dream half remembered. Others insisted the disappearances were punishment, that the town had sheltered her against God's will. Doors were bolted. Children were kept from school. The marketplace emptied before dusk, leaving the streets silent long before nightfall. The orphanage became a fortress of fear. Nurses huddled together, too frightened to enter the dormitories after dark. A ledger records that one of them muttered, "Asterisk, she is not taking them. She is calling them." Asterisk, and still Emma remained untouched. While fear spread like fire through dry brush, she walked freely, her steps unhurried, her gaze unwavering. Some nights she stood at the cemetery gate, staring at the ruined steeple as though expecting something or someone to rise from the shattered ground. By winter's edge, Rothschild had shrunk to a husk of itself. Families fled in silence, abandoning homes without notice. Entire roads lay empty. Yet the heart of the town, the orphanage, the church, and the child within them, remained as though bound by something no one dared name. It began as a hum, low, breathy, almost childlike. Nurses first heard it drifting through the orphanage halls at night, a fragile melody that made the hairs along their arms stiffen. At first they thought Emma was singing to herself, but the sound did not stop when her lips were closed. It grew louder when she slept. Soon, the children picked it up. Without prompting, they began repeating the tune in whispers, swaying in their cots with blank expressions. When questioned, they could not recall doing it. Some woke, with bleeding gums from grinding their teeth in rhythm to the sound. The melody spread beyond the orphanage. Farmers in distant fields reported hearing it carried on the wind, threading itself through the rustle of corn stalks. Merchants claimed it echoed faintly from their cellars, woven into the creak of barrels. The church itself was not spared. During service, as the congregation tried to sing the psalms, Emma's song rose beneath their words, souring every note until the choir fell into dissonance. The tune was simple, but it carried something unnatural, like a lullaby meant not to soothe, but to dismantle the mind. Those who heard it too long suffered visions, of fire crawling across their skin, of hollow-eyed children standing in doorways, of earth cracking open beneath their feet. In Father Albrecht's journal, his final coherent entry reads, Asterisk, it is not her song. It is memory of something that was buried and should have remained buried. Asterisk. From then on, Rothschild did not sleep. The town lay awake in dread, listening to the orphan's song ripple through the night air, wondering what it summoned, or whom it was meant to awaken. The end did not arrive with fire or storm. It came with silence, a silence so vast it drowned the air itself. On the night of December 3rd, 1874, Rothschild ceased to be a town in any living sense. Witnesses, those few who survived, spoke of a sudden stillness that swept through the streets just after the orphan's song stopped. Dogs collapsed in their kennels. Horses froze mid-stride, foam crusting their mouths. The church bell, fractured since the lightning strike, tolled once of its own accord, a hollow sound that rolled across the empty fields. Inside the orphanage, every lamp guttered. Children sat upright in their beds, their mouths moving in silence, as though the song had entered them but no longer needed sound to carry. The nurses prayed until their voices bled. One tore her eyes out, screaming that she could see what waited behind her lids. The townsfolk who still remained gathered in the square, torches trembling in their hands. They demanded Emma be brought out, cast away, sacrificed if need be. But no one dared to fetch her, for when she appeared, on the orphanage steps, barefoot in the frost, every torch dimmed at once. She did not speak. She did not move. Yet those who looked upon her swore they felt their memories splitting, as if some part of them was being rewritten, rearranged. One man tried to strike her with an axe. The blade rusted to dust before it could fall. By dawn, Rothschild was empty. Homes abandoned mid-meal. Fires left smoldering in hearths. No bodies. No blood. Just a faint echo of humming, still trapped in the boards of the orphanage walls. Emma Richter remained. Alone, or perhaps never alone at all. What became of Rothschild was never printed in newspapers, never spoken of beyond hushed warnings in the counties that bordered its empty fields. Officially, the town's disappearance was blamed on disease, cholera, some said. Others insisted it was fire or migration westward, though no wagons or graves were ever found. Rothschild was erased as neatly as ink blotted from a page. Yet the record remains. Parish ledgers locked in state archives. Fragments of Father Albrecht's journals. And, most chilling, a government memorandum from 1875, stamped in red ink, asterisk, subject Richter contained. Further mention forbidden. Asterisk, no explanation. No details. Only a warning that those who sought to revisit Rothschild would meet with federal silence. Travelers who passed through the overgrown valley where the town once stood speak of foundations buried in moss, crooked stones marking graves with no names. On windless nights, they swear they hear faint singing, a lullaby without words, threading itself through the trees. And in the archives of forgotten seminary, one final note lies scrawled in the margin of Winterbourne's journals. Asterisk, she is not bound to time nor to place. She is recurrence. Each century, the vessel returns. What we bury, she remembers. What we silence, she sings. Asterisk, Emma Richter was never seen again, at least not under that name. But the silence surrounding her has the weight of conspiracy, the kind that seeps deeper than superstition. What happened in Rothschild was not an isolated tragedy. It was a pattern, a cycle, a wound in the fabric of America's hidden past. And perhaps the most terrifying truth is this. Somewhere, some child already hums her song, waiting for us to remember what we were never